A quick disclaimer before we start this video. I do not work at Bungie, nor do I claim to know anything about their actual development cycle or future plans. I'm simply citing facts that have been presented at previous talks and that we've experienced through community managers and engineers throughout the lifetime of the game. On September 24th, 2020, the Arbiter of Bread bestowed upon us a TWAB. Earlier in the day, DMG had given us a warning that there was some technical talk in the TWAB, which instantly grabbed my interest. If you haven't already, you can go to the full post yourself by checking the link in the cards, but I'm going to go ahead and get right into the point of this video. In the section titled Talking Tech, Preparing for Beyond Light, David Aldridge, the Destiny engineering director, gave us some great information and insight into what changes will be arriving with Europa in the fall. Aldridge wrote, "We shifted our mission scripting model to run on the physics host instead of the mission host." The first thing that everyone was wondering? Is Beyond Light going to have a new engine? The short answer? Kind of. If you had a broom and replaced the handle, then replaced the head, is it still the same broom? At what point does it stop being the original broom? This same thought can be applied to the Tiger engine. I go over some longer history of the Tiger engine in my previous video on Destiny 2's game engine situation, but here's a quick recap. Tiger was created from the Blam engine that powered the last of Bungie's Halo games. Tiger was built on top of most of the core parts of Blam, with pretty substantial systems being completely preserved and a few being modified, so keep that in mind when people ask about a new engine, because technically speaking, Tiger wasn't completely new when it was born. The engineering team started small and grew as they came closer to full production swing, and they worked on converting the existing step-lock-based single-player experience into a fully realized, dynamic, multiplayer shooter that was fast-paced and still felt like it was a single-player experience when it came to gunplay and player freedom. This, as well as lots of other information you'll hear in this video, come from a talk that Justin Truman did at GDC in 2015 titled Shared World Shooter, Destiny's Networked Mission Architecture. There's no video on it, but it's a good read if you want to understand how the game engine was built. With the ongoing development of Destiny 2, there have been many changes made to the engine throughout the years. Many people don't realize that engine changes aren't always directly visible to the player. Sometimes there's a function designed to handle something such as inventory interactions that can be optimized, or an underlying system that can be rebuilt to optimize gameplay or interactions. We saw this a couple weeks ago when Bungie updated something on the back end that resulted in up to 10 times faster inventory transfer speeds when using external apps such as DIM or the companion app. These changes serve to further the original notion of the game engine. The original design pillars of the game, according to Truman, were making a kick-ass action game that was always co-op and encouraged players to meet strangers with untethered freedom. That kick-ass action game part of the design manifested itself through the form of being a game that feels highly responsive like a single-player shooter, so they started with the Halo PvP network model as their baseline for the development of Destiny's networking and instance handling. That leads us into the first set of background information. Instance hosting. Halo's, and therefore Destiny's networking models, are built around several hosts. The mission, or activity host, and the physics host were both mentioned by Aldridge in the TWAB, but there's another one that some people may have heard of before, the bubble host. Now, one thing that we should be on the same page of is the definition of host. For the purposes of this video, anytime I refer to something as a host, it is the device or process that is handling its part of the simulation and has control authority over what happens in the game. This line may get a bit blurry considering there are 3 different types of hosts in the game, as well as a somewhat non-rigid control structure that they operate within. Bubble hosting. Let's take a closer look at the last host type I mentioned and work our way back up to the changes that are being made. The first question is, what is a bubble? The shortest answer is an autonomous unit of simulation. This unit, or bubble, can be treated as a container for asset loading, with which the game can decide what needs to be loaded and unloaded. The common standard for most destinations was up to 6 players with 25 AI units being processed at any given time in a bubble, although this may be outdated since I got these numbers from a talk that's 5 years old now. It's also worth noting that an individual enemy isn't always an individual AI unit. Sometimes they can be part of a squad, which has a type of hybrid collective goal and AI system. The structure that the game is built on hasn't changed, though, just in the same way that instanced hosting is built on the bubble system. Each bubble that a player can exist inside of has a dedicated host associated with it. Every time you run through a load zone and see your fire teammates disappear and reload into existence, you cross a bubble border. Bubbles are the physical location handlers for Destiny and control everything from public events to planetary material spawns. Traditionally, bubble hosting would be done on either a dedicated server that handles everything or on the player's local device. The problem with hosting this on a server comes from operating price, bandwidth, and processing limitations. Bubble hosting on a player's local device is typically adequate for FPS games, but that's where Destiny's unique exploration freedom becomes a conflict of interest. With the client-hosted bubble instances, a player bubble would have to be chosen as the host, to which all other players entering the area would have to connect to. If the host player then leaves, the game has to stop everything and figure out who the next host will be, then grant that client authority over the simulation and reconcile any changes that might have been missed due to network errors. Now scale that up to people entering and exiting instances several times a minute and the game becomes unplayable due to loading screens. The solution with the bubble host was to make a hybrid system. Bubble hosts are persistent, always running on the server, and always keeping track of what is happening in the game world. If a certain door is open or not, if a dusklight shard is under a bridge, or if there's a public event going on, are all things that the bubble host has control over and is responsible for. This keeps the network latency low since players aren't having to download excessive amounts of data just to walk around, and it provides a system that makes dynamic social spaces very manageable, all while changing hosts every 160 seconds to keep server load balanced. The cost comes out to be the limitations of not being able to track very much at once, and this is where the activity host comes into play. Activity hosting. According to Aldridge in the TWAB, the mission host only knew how many combatants were alive in a squad and what that squad was generally trying to accomplish. In this context, mission and activity are synonymous. The activity host, like the bubble host, runs on the Destiny game servers, but also with a copy on the game client for communication and parity. The difference is that the bubble host is always running even if there are no players in the bubble at the time. The activity host is only started once an activity is started. This is because the activity host handles things associated with activities or missions, such as event triggers, world change requests for the bubble host, etc. The example that Truman used in his talk presents a situation where the game is waiting for the player to kill a few enemies before completing the mission. The activity host will spawn however many enemies are needed by sending a request to the bubble handler, wait for those enemies to no longer exist, then complete the objective once the conditions are met. In this situation, the bubble host doesn't care what the enemies are being used for, if they exist or not, where they are, how much health they have, or anything like that. Meanwhile, the activity host is in a very similar situation, except it's using what's known as a sensor to determine the value of whatever's being tracked. In this case, the value would be how many enemies are left alive. The objective tracked by a sensor could be anything from the state of a Vex plate on the floor and if it's finished with its animation, to the state of a button on a wall, or even the position of a special target. Back to the TWAB when Aldridge said the mission host only knew how many combatants were alive in a squad and what that squad is generally trying to accomplish. This is because in many situations there is no reason for the activity to require health values or positions, or any sort of other granular data, because this entire thing is handled on a case-by-case basis. From a processing standpoint, tracking unnecessary data can cause exponential processing delays considering how many enemies can be in the instance at any given time, so part of the reason that sensors are used is for optimization. The problem with the sensor system is that the mission and activity creators have to preemptively think about what they need to track and build the entire mission from start to finish with the whole picture in mind. If a sensor isn't defined and associated at the start, then the activity host can't see whatever value the sensor is supposed to be tracking. The amount of values and data that can be presented to the activity host is massive, but the amount that is actually used is only a fraction of the potential. This is where we get to our final part of the trinity, the physics host. This is where we get to the bread and butter of the game engine. The physics host, unlike its counterparts, runs exclusively on the client. Similar to the activity host, the physics host is not persistent, but is always running in any bubble in which a player is present. The physics host is part of the game that cares about everything from entity positions to health points. The physics host keeps track of everything else that goes on in the game that the bubble host and activity host don't handle, but with a bit of a caveat. Going back to the sensors that I just discussed, the physics host is what triggers the activity host sensors. If there's a health trigger in an encounter, the physics host will calculate and manage the health values and report relevant thresholds to the activity host, which then can send requests to the bubble host if needed. This includes things such as one of the 6 health segments in Shuro Chi's health bar from The Last Wish that progress the fight to the next area, or the 4 health segments from Insurrection Prime that reset the detonation timer. This interaction structure is likely part of the reason that you can run into damage calculation glitches with net limiting. If the physics host is claiming a certain amount of damage was dealt but is unable to report this to the activity host, there is no reconciliation or validation occurring regarding damage to an activity target. While the activity host runs in parity, meaning there's a copy running both on the game client as well as the server in parallel for data validation and protection, doing so with the physics host is a relatively large hurdle to overcome. The amount of data points that the physics host tracks mean that the sheer operating cost of a dedicated server running the physics host is a major deterrent in itself. There's also other factors to consider, such as the bandwidth required to handle hundreds or even thousands of data entries being transmitted every second. This works against the original design pillars of the game engine's design, specifically the part about low latency environments that feel like single-player games. Now we understand at least the basics of how separate hosts work, which is pretty complicated. So if you're still watching at this point, then please don't forget to leave a like and hit subscribe for more studies like this one. Did you hit the button? Congratulations, you just triggered a scripted event. Let's look at how Destiny currently handles scripted events. Current scripting practices. This will include a bit of a recap of what each host can do, just with some more real-life examples instead of theoretical situations. Let's say you log into Destiny and are sitting in orbit deciding what to do. You decide to go to the EDZ and run a heroic adventure for the Flashpoint. From orbit, you click on the mission in the director and launch into it. As your ship makes its jump, the game is doing quite a bit in the background. The first thing that happens is matchmaking, in order to establish the physics, bubble, and activity hosts. Once the bubble host and activity host are determined, the game then has to decide what to do about the physics host. If the player is loading into a bubble that is already populated, which only happens if they're going into a public bubble or if they're in a fire team and someone is already connected to the private bubble, then the game will connect the new player to the existing physics host in the instance. If there's nobody in the bubble, or if the player is being loaded into a new private bubble, then the game elects the player's local device to be the physics host. If anyone else comes into the player's instance, the new players will be connected to our existing player's physics host. If the physics host leaves the instance, they are unloaded for the players that are still in the instance, and a new physics host is elected from the players remaining in the area. That's why players disappear and reappear every time a bubble boundary is crossed. Now, I know I just mentioned some shenanigans with the bubble host regarding private versus public instances, so let's clarify that a bit. Let's use the Lake of Shadows as an example. When you first load in, you're connected to a Trostland bubble host, a physics host from a player in the area if there is one, and your own activity host for the mission. As you get on your Sparrow and start heading towards the strike area, the game starts loading the assets and starts to go through the matchmaking process for the next bubble. That next bubble is a private bubble that was initialized by your activity host, since the activity host needed to spawn certain things in the area such as blights, taken centurions, and the like. As the activity host is spinning up a new bubble for you, the game is also trying to figure out who the next physics host will be. This is usually whoever enters the private bubble first, since enemies in physics have to be calculated by something other than the servers. So you may be asking, why are you making it sound like Destiny has dedicated servers? That's because technically it does, just not in the way that most people imagine dedicated servers to work. Most people think that an entire game simulation is run on a dedicated server, and that every little thing is calculated, validated, and confirmed by a server that then tells the game client what to do next. In the case of Destiny, that would mean that all three host types are running on a server and sending everything back to the player, when in reality, the physics host is running locally, and only mission or world-related processing is occurring on the server. According to Truman's talk, using fully dedicated servers would require almost a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning 1 million players would need 500,000 servers in average conditions. With the separation of hosts, Bungie can fit 1 million players into only a few hundred servers. Here's a few specs for the servers that Bungie actually used for Destiny 1. The activity host was only a 45 meg stripped down version of the game client, running with up to 4,600 instances at 10 Hz per server, which had 40 processing cores and 256 gigs of RAM. This is where the 10 Hz number comes from that people throw around when talking about Destiny's tick rate, but it only applies to activities and bubbles, not physics. So what does it mean when Aldridge says they're moving to the physics host for scripting? Well, that's the question, isn't it? In my mind, there are two major paths that Bungie could have taken here. Option 1, keeping physics purely client-side. Option 2, running a physics client in parity on the servers without the ability to become a host of an instance. Keep in mind, just because the scripting is now running by the physics host model does not mean that the full physics system is needed to run an activity. It just means that scripting has access to much more of the game without needing a middleman, but let's entertain the two options I just listed. In both cases, the physics host would still be run on a local device inside of an instance. I doubt Bungie wants to blast a hole in the ozone layer above Washington and have an electrical build a match, but what are the pros and cons of each option? Option 1, keeping everything on the client, means more processing load for the client to do. This may not be that big of a deal considering there are likely other optimizations being done in the game, so there could be more overhead room on the processing stack for some extra triggers and handlers, but this would also keep the servers from being overloaded while maintaining the single-player FPS feel of the game. This also means that anti-cheat could still be difficult, because if a bad actor manages to crack the physics host validation, and they are the host of an instance, then they could do whatever they'd like to in the instance, since there would be no server keeping track of and reconciling everything. So what if the server was keeping track of everything? If Bungie put a physics client up in parity on the servers, then there would be a bit more server load since every bubble instance would need a physics client associated with it. That drives up server cost, both in terms of money but also processing time, not to mention bandwidth requirements depending on what all the server would be sent. In both situations, as with all things, there are pros and cons. But instead of spin-foiling what Bungie might or might not do, let's talk about what they could do with the physics host as the script foundation. What does physics host scripting allow for? In a way, that depends on what I just mentioned. Depending on how Bungie implements the system, there will likely be some things that they can and can't do. For the sake of this video, let's assume that they use whatever option gives them the most flexibility and freedom for making new activities and systems. So what are the possibilities? Better anti-cheat that can proactively stop, teleport, or ammo hacks instead of reactively sending a report to Bungie. Easier world event creation and handling for live events, community challenges, or anything of the like. More complex mechanics, such as having to look at something instead of interacting, or having to move fast enough in a certain direction, or basically anything that can be driven by data in the game. Real-time interactions with other players in the world, even if there aren't other players in your instance, almost like a better version of the Guardian Games Flag or Seraph Tower progress. Persistent world states for live events where a part of the world is dynamic, such as the location of a platform or where a Vex gate takes you, all depending on the time of day or how many bullets are in your gun. Hey, they might even be able to fix ball duping for good. Why is all of this not currently possible? Well, the answer would be the sensor system having to act as a middleman between the physics host and the activity host. Instead of having to explicitly connect each and every aspect of the game to an object or game state and then read the sensor for it, the game will be able to just read the object or game state directly. No more bottleneck. This could even, theoretically, pave the way for less bugs with complex mechanics due to the development team not having to jump through as many hoops for new interactions. Less hoops could also translate to less time required to make a new mission or activity, as well as fix existing problems that do arise. But that's pretty much it. That's what it means for the scripting model to be moving from the mission host to the physics host. I didn't really talk about matchmaking changes since David Aldridge touched on that in the TWAB, and there's not much more depth to it beyond what he already covered. The same goes for the content building and patching pipeline, which I did briefly touch on. I personally think that the faster timelines is a direct result of moving to the physics host and having less things to search through for bug fixing and also less things needing to be made for a new activity. One thing that is interesting is the smaller install size, which will be only about 60 gigs on PC. Part of this might be from the amount of content that is being vaulted, but I can't say for certain what the direct causes are. Part of that file size reduction might even be from the face system overhaul, which currently stores every combination of face appearances as a separate data entry and model, but will be moving to a dynamic projection system. This will open the door for more cosmetic options for your Guardian, and possibly even things like activity-related appearance changes. If you're in the tower during the dawning, you might be able to see snow building up on an Exo's face. Basically, think of the new face system as being similar to the shader system. Speaking of faces, the EDZ and Nessus are getting a bit of a facelift with their lights, although this isn't really anything noteworthy. It's pretty common for Bungie to touch things up and breathe some new life into older destinations, as we've seen with Forsaken and Shadowkeep, but I am a bit surprised that they intentionally and explicitly mentioned it in the TWAB. So, what does all of this mean? Going forward, not much is going to change at first, like Aldridge said. They're just establishing the systems and laying the foundation for what is to come. You can expect bugs, as with any major core system overhaul. They'll likely appear in the form of quest objectives not completing properly, incorrect task counting, and maybe some wrong spawn issues. We already know about the new weather system, which will be very interesting to watch considering the new reliance on the physics host and the possibilities it allows for. I assume the new seasonal activity will be more than a Gambit public event, possibly on the scale of the Sundial instead of Altars of Sorrow or Interference, and it will likely use some of the new opportunities that the scripting changes will bring. Other than that, Destiny will continue to be the same great game we know and love, just with some more ice. Performance will likely see a bump from the yearly housekeeping that the engineers do, and we could see networking have changes for better or worse, but I don't know enough about what is changing to really be able to comment on that. Speaking of comments, feel free to leave one below regarding anything that you think I might have missed or got wrong, or you can make suggestions on what you think my next video topic should be on. I hope this video helped clarify some things and bring others to light, but thank you for watching. Keep being awesome, I'll see you guys next time.